The night he was supposed to kill me, the forest went perfectly, unnaturally still. I felt it the way you feel a door closing in a house you thought was empty. That slow, certain pressure against the back of your skull that tells you something has changed, and the world you were standing in a moment ago no longer exists. The trees weren't moving, not one branch, not one leaf. And it was October in the Asheville territory, where the wind never stopped, where it came down off the northern ridge every single evening like it had somewhere to be, like it had been doing it since before any of us were born. But not tonight. Tonight the whole mountain was holding its breath. I pressed my bare feet into the cold ground and waited. That's what it means to be what I am. Not weak. God, I wish people would stop reaching for that word. It isn't weakness to feel things other wolves can't. It isn't weakness to know something is coming before the scouts do, before the elders do, before the alpha with all his power and all his arrogance has the first whisper of a clue. It's a burden. It's a lonely, bone-deep burden that nobody asked me to carry, and nobody wants to hear about. I had known something was wrong with that forest for 3 days. 3 days of my skin feeling too tight, too alert, like it was trying to peel itself off my body and run without me. 3 days of waking before dawn with my wolf packing the inside of my chest like a caged thing, scratching at my ribs, whining low in her throat at nothing I could name. I had told them. I always told them. And they had looked at me the way they always looked at me, with that particular brand of patient, pitying dismissal that is somehow worse than cruelty, because at least cruelty acknowledges you exist. But standing there that night, barefoot in the dark, with the mountains silent around me and the knowing settled deep into the marrow of my bones, I wasn't thinking about them. I was thinking about him. The wolf I had touched. The wolf who had looked at me with gold eyes and forgotten, just for one terrible, impossible moment, that he was supposed to want me dead. I would remember that moment for the rest of my life. The Asheville forest had a sound it made when everything was right. A low, layered breathing, wind threading through pine needles, the creek running somewhere below the eastern ridge, the small, unseen things rustling through undergrowth with no particular urgency. It was the sound of a world that didn't know it was being listened to. The sound of ordinary alive. It wasn't making that sound tonight. I stood at the tree line with my feet in the cold moss and my arms loose at my sides, and I felt it the way you feel the moment just before someone touches your shoulder. That prickling, full-body awareness that something is already in motion, that you are already too late to stop it, that all you can do now is be very, very still and wait to learn what shape it takes. The pines stood too straight. The wind had pulled back like a held breath. Even the creek sounded muffled, distant, like the earth itself had pressed a hand over its own mouth. Something was in those trees. Something that didn't belong to our territory. Something old enough that the land recognized it before any of us did, and old enough that the land was afraid. My wolf knew it too. She wasn't packing tonight. She was pressed flat against the inside of my chest, ears low, eyes fixed on the dark between the trees, absolutely motionless. Not fear exactly. I had felt her afraid before, and it was a frantic thing, all scrambling and noise. This was different. This was the stillness of an animal that has just realized it is in the presence of something categorically larger than itself. Something that does not need to move quickly because it has never needed to. I should have gone back inside. I knew that. I stood there knowing it with every cold, sharpened nerve in my body. But knowing things had never been enough to make me turn away from them. That was my gift, I suppose, or my flaw, depending on who in the pack you asked, and I already knew what most of them would say. The darkness between the trees shifted, and I stayed exactly where I was. I always saw it. That's what it means to be me, to stand at the edge of the thing everyone else refuses to look at, and look anyway. They called me the Hollow Omega. Not to my face, not usually, but in a pack of wolves, whispers travel the way scent does, low to the ground, carried on currents you can't see, arriving before you're ready for them. I had been hearing it since I was 12 years old, standing in the middle of the communal hall with my hands pressed flat against the wooden table, because the room had felt wrong and I hadn't known yet how to keep that knowing off my face. Hollow, like I was missing something. Like whatever should have been inside me, the strength, the wolf fire, the dominance that the Asheville pack measured everything by, had simply failed to arrive. They weren't entirely wrong about the absence. They were completely wrong about what it meant. I wasn't hollow. I was the opposite of hollow. I was so full of things nobody else could feel that sometimes I couldn't breathe past them. The land's unease pressing against my sternum like a second heartbeat. The pack's collective emotion running beneath my skin like water I hadn't chosen to drink. Every shift in the air. Every silence that lasted a half second too long. Every wrong note in the ordinary music of this mountain that everyone else had stopped listening to so long ago, they'd forgotten it was playing. That was my gift, the hearing, the knowing. The thing they had spent my entire life trying to convince me was a defect. I had tried to explain it once to our pack elder, a broad, weathered woman named Dorna who smelled like wood smoke and certainty, and had never in her life doubted anything she hadn't decided herself. I had been 15. I had told her about the knowing in careful, precise words, the way I'd been rehearsing for weeks, the way the land spoke, the way I could feel disturbance in the territory like a splinter under skin, small, specific, impossible to ignore. She had looked at me for a long moment. Then she had told me that sensitivity was not a power, that what I was describing was anxiety, that I needed to train harder, run more, push my wolf until she stopped flinching at shadows and started behaving like a proper Asheville wolf. I had walked out of that meeting with my spine straight and my jaw locked and something quietly closing inside my chest. A door. Not slamming. That would have been too dramatic, too much energy spent on people who had already decided what I was. Just a soft, definitive click. I stopped explaining after that. But I didn't stop knowing. That was the loneliness of it, I think, not the dismissal itself, which I had grown a kind of scar tissue around over the years, but the specific, suffocating loneliness of being correct, over and over and over. Feeling the wrongness before it arrived, nomming it in the privacy of my own skull, watching it come true while the pack scrambled to react to something I had already mourned 3 days prior. Being right in total silence, filing it away, moving on. Sometimes I wondered if that was worse than not knowing at all. At least ignorance had company. There had been a time, younger, softer, before Dorna and 100 moments like her, when I had let myself believe there was someone out there who would hear me, not just tolerate me, not just pat my shoulder and suggest I was overthinking it. Actually hear me. Actually look at the thing I was pointing at instead of at my hand doing the pointing. A mate, maybe. Someone whose instincts ran deep enough to recognize what mine were doing. Someone who would feel the land go silent and look at me not with pity, but with the specific, steady attention of a person who already knew I was right. I had stopped believing in that too. Or I had tried to. Standing at the tree line that night, with the forest holding itself like a secret and my wolf pressed silent against my ribs, I felt the phantom shape of that absence more sharply than I had in years. Something was in those trees. And somewhere in the part of me I had spent a decade trying to quiet, I already knew exactly what it was. Let me tell you about Alpha Crest Damon. Not the version he performed at pack meetings, the broad shoulders squared, the jaw set, the voice dropping to that particular register that made younger wolves instinctively lower their eyes. Not the carefully constructed image of a man who had earned his position through strength and wisdom, and the kind of steady, ancient authority that a pack needs the way it needs water and territory. The real version. Damon was afraid. He had always been afraid, and like most afraid men handed too much power too young. He had built an entire architecture of cruelty around that fear, so that no one, including himself, would ever have to look directly at it. The Asheville pack ran on a simple, brutal economy. Strength was visible. Strength was measurable. Strength was dominance challenges at the full moon and border patrols and the size of your wolf and the volume of your growl. Everything that couldn't be weighed and witnessed and ranked was, by definition, worthless. And Damon had spent 11 years as our alpha enforcing that economy with the particular enthusiasm of a man who needed it to be true. Because if it wasn't true, if the things I felt were real, if the knowing was a legitimate power, Then the hierarchy he sat at the top of was built on a measurement that excluded what actually mattered. And that, I understood, was the one thing he could not afford to consider. His enforcer was a wolf named Breck, thick-necked, loyal in the way that dogs who have been hit too many times are loyal, which is to say not from love but from the careful calculus of survival. Breck didn't think. He observed what Damon rewarded and he replicated it, which made him, in some ways, more dangerous than a wolf who chose cruelty deliberately because there was no reasoning with a mirror. Then there was the pack itself, 43 wolves. Good people, most of them, in the individual moments when the hierarchy wasn't watching. People who brought food to sick packmates and laughed loudly at fires and loved their children with a fierceness that made your chest ache to witness. But crowds are not made of individuals. Crowds are made of whatever the person at the top has decided is true. And Damon had decided I was nothing. So to the crowd, I was nothing. I had learned to carry that. I had learned to press it flat inside me and walk through the communal hall with my eyes level and my shoulders even and give them absolutely nothing to confirm. But 3 days ago I had stood in that same hall, pine-floored, fire-lit, smelling of 43 wolves and the particular tension of a pack that had been receiving bad news in installments. And I had opened my mouth. And I had told them what I knew. The territory's eastern border. The silence moving through the trees like a tide coming in. Something crossing into Asheville land that was older and larger and more deliberate than anything we had encountered in my lifetime. I had felt it building for days. I had the specific, bone-certain knowing of it lodged behind my sternum like a coal. Damon had looked at me from across the fire. And then he had smiled. Not warmly. The other kind, the kind that is a door closing, that is a verdict already rendered. That is an audience being invited to laugh along before the joke has even landed. The Hollow Omega, he said, has a feeling. The hall laughed. Not all of them, there were a few faces that went carefully blank, a few eyes that found the floor. But enough, always enough. I had stood there in the middle of it and let it pass over me like weather. I would not beg, I never had. But I would remember. I always remembered. They sent me on the Eastern Patrol 3 days later. Not because they believed me. That much was clear in the way Damon handed out the assignment, casual, almost bored, the way you assign someone to sweep a floor you've already decided is clean. It was punishment dressed as duty. A reminder that my place in this pack was determined by his convenience, not my value. Breck handed me the patrol route without looking at me. A single folded piece of paper. Eastern Ridge, down to the creek border, back along the tree line by nightfall. Alone. I took the paper. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that would have landed anywhere useful, and I had stopped wasting words on walls years ago. I shifted at the tree line just after midday, when the light was still honest, and the sky was the pale, washed-out gray of late autumn pressing down through the pines. My wolf was small by Asheville standards, lean and dark, built more for endurance than for the kind of brute speed the pack valued in its warriors. She moved low and quiet through the undergrowth, her nose working the air in steady, methodical sweeps. The wrongness hit me before I cleared the first ridge. Not a sound, not a scent or not one I could name yet, just the edge of something, the ghost of a thing pressing against the back of my awareness the way a storm presses against a window before it breaks. My wolf slowed without me telling her to. Her ears went flat. Her paws found the ground more carefully, each step deliberate, soundless. The trees here were old. Ancient, some of them pines so thick through the trunk that 3 wolves couldn't circle them with their arms joined, their bark black with age and moisture, their roots rising from the ground in great twisted knots that looked, in the low light, like something sleeping. The undergrowth had thinned. The forest floor was bare and dark and soft with decades of fallen needles, and it muffled every sound so completely that my own breathing seemed to come from far away. And then the scent arrived. Pine, deep and cold and resinous, the way pine smells in the heart of winter when the sap has pulled down into the roots and the tree is keeping its life hidden. And under that smoke, old smoke, the kind that lives in wood long after the fire is gone. And under that, something else entirely. Something I had no category for. Something that bypassed my rational mind entirely and went straight to the oldest part of my wolf. The part that existed before language, before hierarchy, before 43 wolves and a communal hall and a man who had decided what I was worth. Ancient. That was the only word my mind produced. Whatever this was, it was ancient. My wolf stopped completely. And then I saw him. Not clearly, not all at once. The forest doesn't give you things like that. It reveals in pieces, in glimpses, the way the truth usually arrives. First, the size of him, which was wrong in a way that made my eyes try to recalibrate. A wolf so large that my mind initially registered him as part of the landscape. A shadow, a trick of the failing light between the trees. Dark fur, near black, the kind of coat that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. Then the stillness of him. He wasn't moving. He was standing 40 feet inside the tree line with the absolute, total stillness of an animal that has been still for a very long time. Not frozen, not hiding, but genuinely, profoundly at rest in a way that suggested the concept of urgency had simply never applied to him. And then he turned his head. And I saw his eyes. Gold, not amber, not the common warm brown that passed for gold in most wolves I'd known. True gold, deep and liquid and lit from somewhere internal, like light moving through old honey, like something burning slow and permanent at the center of him. They found mine, across the 40 feet of silent forest between us. And my wolf, my careful, cautious, press-flat-hand-weight wolf who had spent her entire life learning to make herself small, went absolutely, completely still. Not in fear. I need to be clear about that. I have felt fear in this body, and I know its particular texture, the cold rush of it, the way it hollows you out from the sternum down. This wasn't that. This was recognition. This was the specific, impossible, bone-deep knowing of a thing I had never encountered, but somehow already understood, arriving in my chest like a key finding a lock it was made for. He saw me. The gold eyes held mine for 3 full seconds, long enough to be certain, long enough that I couldn't later convince myself I had imagined it. And then the darkness between the trees shifted, and he was gone. As if he had never been there. But the scent of pine and smoke, and something ancient stayed in my lungs for the rest of the patrol. And my wolf, pressed against my ribs, was no longer afraid of anything. Something had changed. I just didn't know yet what it was going to cost me. I told them again that night. I know how that sounds. I had stood in that hall 3 days prior and watched Damon turn my warning into a punchline while 43 wolves laughed or looked away, and I had walked out with my spine straight and that quiet door clicking shut inside me, and I had promised myself, not for the first time, that I was done offering things to people who had decided they didn't want them. But this was different. This wasn't a feeling anymore. This wasn't the knowing, the atmospheric pressure of wrongness building at the edges of my awareness. I had seen him. I had stood 40 feet from a wolf so large he didn't fit the categories my mind had for wolves. A wolf whose eyes burned gold and ancient and certain. A wolf who had looked at me across a silent forest with the calm, deliberate attention of something that had already made a decision. He wasn't passing through. Whatever that wolf was, whatever pack stood behind those gold eyes, he was here with intention. And the eastern border was not going to hold. So I went back to the hall. I waited until the evening meal, when the pack was gathered and the fire was high and Damon was in his chair at the head of the long table with Breck at his shoulder, and the comfortable, well-fed looseness of a man who had never once been wrong about anything, because he had never once allowed anyone to prove it. I stood up. The table went quiet in patches, spreading outward from where I stood the way silence spreads when something unexpected happens. First the wolves nearest to me, then the ones who noticed them noticing, until the whole hall was a held breath and Damon's eyes had found mine across the fire. I told them what I had seen. I was precise. I was steady. I gave them the size, the coloring, the location, the scent profile. I told them the eastern border needed reinforcement tonight, not tomorrow, not after the morning patrol confirmed what I already knew. Tonight. Damon let me finish. That was the first sign that something was different this time. He usually cut me off earlier. Then he said very quietly, "Take her outside." I had time to understand what that meant. A fraction of a second, enough to know, not enough to matter. Breck's hand closed around my arm before I finished the thought. The cold hit me when the hall doors opened, the October air sharp and immediate against my skin, the darkness of the yard swallowing the firelight the moment the doors swung shut behind us. There were two of them, Breck and another enforcer whose name I had never learned because he had never spoken directly to me, only ever around me, about me, in the third person that people use for things they've decided aren't quite present. I won't dwell on what happened next. Not because it broke me, it didn't. I want to be clear about that too, the same way I was clear about the recognition in the forest. I have been broken before and I know that feeling, know the specific place inside yourself where something gives way and doesn't come back. That place stayed intact. But my body took damage. The frozen ground came up fast and the cold was extraordinary, the particular breathtaking cold of bare skin against October earth. And somewhere in the middle of it, I bit down on the inside of my cheek and tasted copper, bright and immediate, flooding my mouth. I didn't make a sound. I would not give them that. I never had. I lay in the dark of the yard with the cold pressing into me from every direction, and the hall light bleeding gold under the door and my wolf, a low, continuous vibration in my chest. Not panic, not surrender, but something that felt almost like fury held in a very tight fist, and I stared up at the sky between the pines. The stars were very clear. The forest was still. And then, from somewhere deep in the eastern tree line, distant but distinct, unmistakable in the absolute quiet of that mountain night, came a sound. A growl. Low, sustained. The kind of sound that doesn't build or peak or resolve. The kind of sound that simply exists, like weather, like gravity, like something that has been present for a very long time and has only just decided to be heard. My wolf went still inside me. And then, very slowly, she lifted her head. He felt it. I don't know how I knew that. I knew it the same way I knew everything. The same bone-deep, sourceless, unargued knowing that had defined my entire life and cost me everything it had cost me. He felt what they did. And he was coming. They came out of the eastern tree line at dawn. Not running. That was the first thing I noticed, still lying where Breck had left me, my cheek pressed against the frozen ground, my breath coming in slow, deliberate measures because slow and deliberate was the only kind of breathing that didn't send pain ricocheting through my ribs. They came walking. A line of them emerging from the tree line in the gray pre-dawn light, with the unhurried, absolute certainty of people who have never needed to rush because nothing they have ever pursued has successfully escaped them. 7 wolves in human form. Dark clothing, trail-worn, carrying no weapons because they were the weapons. Moving in a formation that wasn't quite military, but held the memory of military in its bones. The specific, practiced spacing of wolves who had fought together long enough that positioning had become instinct rather than instruction. And at the center of them, him. I knew him before I saw his eyes. The size of him first. Even in human form, he was wrong in the same way he'd been wrong in the forest, occupying more space than the dimensions of his body should have allowed, as though the air around him had decided to include him in its calculations differently than it included everyone else. Dark hair. A jaw that looked like it had been carved with the specific intention of never yielding. A scar that ran from his left temple down across his cheekbone, old and silver-white, the kind of scar that takes years to settle into a face and eventually stops looking like damage and starts looking like geography. And then he turned his head. Gold eyes, finding mine across the yard with the same immediate, unqualified certainty they'd found them in the forest, as if the intervening distance was a formality, as if he had known exactly where I was before he cleared the tree line. Something moved through his face when he saw me on the ground. It wasn't a large movement. He wasn't a man who made large movements with his face. But it was there, a tightening, a shift in those gold eyes that went from the controlled, assessing calm of his approach to something older and quieter and considerably more dangerous. The way a very still body of water changes when something strikes its surface. The ripple was small. What it implied about the depth was not. He looked at me for exactly 2 seconds. Then he looked at Damon. Damon had come out of the hall at the sound of his pack's alarm. Wolves emerging from doors and windows, with the scrambling, disorganized energy of a group that had been surprised despite every warning they'd been given. He stood in the center of the yard, now in yesterday's clothes, with his authority gathered around him like a coat he'd put on too quickly, trying to project the kind of calm that you can only genuinely have if you haven't just realized you made a catastrophic miscalculation. The silence between the two alphas lasted long enough to have weight. Then the gold-eyed wolf spoke. His voice was low. Not quiet low, in the way that certain sounds are low, the way thunder is low, the way the earth is low. It didn't need volume because it had density. Every wolf in that yard heard every word without him raising it even slightly. "That wolf," he said, "belongs to me." Not a declaration of ownership. I understood that even then, cold and damaged on the frozen ground, understanding things the way I always understood them, below the level of language, in the part of me that had always known more than it could explain. He wasn't claiming property. He was correcting a record. He was stating a fact that the universe had already decided, and that Damon's entire operation had just spent the night violating. Damon's jaw tightened. "You're on Asheville land. You have no authority here to—" "I have every authority here." Still that same low, unhurried voice. "You touched what is mine. I felt it from 4 miles away." The yard was absolutely silent. Breck shifted his weight behind Damon's shoulder, and I watched the gold-eyed wolf's gaze move to him, just briefly, just a flick of those ancient eyes, and Breck went still like something had pressed a hand flat against his chest. Damon tried again, the brave, foolish architecture of a man who has confused his local dominance for something universal. "She's an omega, a weak one. She has no value to this pack or any other. You're welcome to the problem of her." I had heard variations of this my entire life. I had built scar tissue around every one of them. But lying on the frozen ground with copper still bright on my tongue and the gray dawn pressing down through the pines, I felt it land differently this time, not because it hurt more, but because someone was hearing it. Someone was standing 10 feet away receiving those words, and I could see, in the absolute stillness of him, what he was doing with them. He was filing them away. The gold eyes came back to mine. And in them, steady and cert, and carrying the particular weight of something that has been decided at a level far below the reach of men like Damon, I saw it clearly. He was not going to forget what had been done here. Neither was I. He took 1 step forward, just one. And the entire yard reorganized itself around that single step, wolves shifting back without deciding to. Damon's assembled pack rearranging like water moving away from a stone dropped into still surface. "Her value," he said, "is not yours to measure." Then he looked at me again, and his voice, when he spoke next, was the same low density as before, but something in it had shifted in a way I felt in my sternum before I processed it in my mind. "Can you stand?" 2 words, a question, not a command, offered into the freezing morning air between us like something careful, like something that understood the difference. I pressed my palms against the frozen earth. And I stood. His name was Kale. I learned that in the first hour, from a woman named Sarah who smelled like cedar and warm bread, and had the kind of face that made you feel immediately, inexplicably, that you had known her longer than you had. She walked beside me as his pack moved back toward the eastern tree line, not hurting me, not guiding me with the particular hand-at-the-elbow pressure that implies you don't trust someone to move correctly on their own, just walking beside me. Matching my pace, which was slower than it should have been, and not commenting on it. "Kale," she said when I asked, like the name was self-evident, like it explained things. "Alpha of the Ironville Pack, Northern Territory mostly. Though mostly is doing a lot of work in that sentence, his territory is." She paused, seeming to search for the right word, extensive. I filed that away and kept walking. The Ironville camp was 3 miles into the eastern forest, set in a natural clearing where the old pines opened up around a granite outcropping, and the creek ran wide and shallow over pale stones. It was not what I expected from a pack that moved with that kind of military precision. There were fires. There was laughter coming from somewhere I couldn't see yet. Someone was cooking something that involved garlic and something smoked, and my stomach, which had not had anything in it since yesterday morning, made a decision about its priorities entirely independent of my dignity. Sarah noticed. She didn't say anything. Within 4 minutes, there was a bowl in my hands. That was the first thing I understood about the Ironville pack. They moved fast when it mattered, and they didn't make you ask. The second thing I understood came later, when Cale addressed them. He gathered them in the clearing as the morning light finally broke through the canopy, proper light, gold and slanted, the first real warmth I had felt in what seemed like days. He stood on the granite outcropping with his hands loose at his sides, and his gold eyes moving across his pack with the steady, unhurried attention of a man who has learned every face in his care and checks them the way you check something valuable. Not performing authority, simply exercising it. He told them I was to be treated as a full member of the pack, not a guest, not a charity case, not a project. A member with all the territory rights and pack protections and basic dignities that designation carried. He said it once. He didn't explain it or justify it or invite discussion. And not one wolf in that clearing questioned it. I stood at the edge of the group with my bowl of food going cold in my hands and felt something move through my chest that I didn't have an immediate name for. Not gratitude exactly. Gratitude implies you didn't deserve the thing, and I was trying very hard to stop operating from that assumption. Not relief either, though there was some of that, warm and unwelcome in its vulnerability. Something quieter than either of those things. Something that felt, cautiously and against my better judgment, like the first structural evidence that belonging might be a real concept, and not just a thing other wolves had. Sarah appeared at my elbow. "You're thinking very loudly," she said pleasantly, taking the bowl from my hands and replacing it with a warmer one. "I do that," I said. "I know," she smiled. "He told us." I looked at her. "He told you about me." "He told us enough." She shrugged, the easy shrug of someone who has long since made peace with operating on partial information. "He said you see things that you've been told your whole life that was a weakness." She paused. "He said that was their loss and our gain." I looked across the clearing to where Cale stood now in quiet conversation with two of his senior wolves, his back partially to me, his profile cut clean against the morning light. The scar along his jaw silver-white and settled. The gold eyes, when they moved, moving with that same slow, absolute certainty. He hadn't looked at me since the yard. Not directly. Not the way he'd looked at me in the forest or across the frozen ground of the Asheville yard with something moving deep behind those ancient eyes. He was giving me space. I understood that the way I understood most things below language, in the bones. What I didn't understand was why the space felt so much like waiting. Sarah was watching me with the warm, knowing expression of someone who has been watching this particular equation solve itself before and is perfectly content to let it take its time. "Why hasn't he claimed me?" The words were out before I decided to say them. Low, not quite steady. Sarah considered this with genuine thoughtfulness, the way she seemed to consider most things. "Because," she said finally, "he wants you to choose it." I looked back at him. And for the first time in longer than I could accurately measure, I felt the door I had closed so quietly, so carefully, so finally inside my chest shift. Just slightly. Just enough. Damon came for me on the 4th night. I felt it before the scouts did. Before the perimeter wolves caught the first scent on the wind. Before anyone in the Ironville camp had reason to look toward the southern tree line with anything more urgent than the idle attention of wolves at rest. I was sitting by the fire with Sarah, my hands wrapped around a cup of something warm and herbal that she had pressed on me without explanation, when the knowing settled into my chest like a stone dropped into still water. Not the slow, building pressure I had felt in the Asheville forest. This was sharp, immediate. A clean, cold blade of certainty that cut through the quiet evening and left me sitting very still with the cup halfway to my mouth and my wolf pressed flat and rigid against my ribs. "They're coming," I said. Sarah looked at me, not with doubt, not with the patient, pitying assessment I had spent my entire life receiving. She looked at me the way you look at a compass when the terrain is unfamiliar, with trust. "How many?" she asked. 12, maybe more. I could feel them, the particular density of organized hostility moving through the forest with the collective energy of wolves who have been told they are right to be angry and have not been required to think about whether that's true. Southern approach, along the creek. Sarah was already on her feet, already moving toward the outcropping where 2 of the senior wolves were stationed, already translating what I had given her into the language of tactical response with the smooth, practiced efficiency of someone who has done this before and done it well. Within 90 seconds, the Ironville pack was in position. Within 3 minutes, the first Asheville wolves broke through the southern tree line. I watched it happen from the edge of the clearing, not hidden, not retreating, because I was done retreating from things I had already seen coming, and I felt the precise moment Cale became aware of the breach. Not because I heard him or saw him move, because the air changed. The same way the air in the Asheville forest had changed on the night I first felt him, that atmospheric shift, that sudden, bone-level awareness of something very old and very powerful deciding to pay attention. He came through the camp like weather. Not running, walking. That same unhurried, absolute stride that I had watched cross the Asheville yard at dawn, the stride of something that does not accelerate because acceleration implies the possibility of being too late, and Cale had never, in his long and ancient life, been too late for anything. Damon was at the front of the Asheville group. Of course he was. Standing in the creek shallows with his wolves fanned behind him and his jaw set with that particular brand of manufactured certainty that I knew so well, the face of a man who has committed to a course of action and is no longer interested in examining whether it was wise. Cale stopped at the water's edge. The silence between them was different this time, heavier, older, carrying the accumulated weight of the frozen yard and my blood on the ground, and every word Damon had said about my value in front of a man who had decided, apparently at the molecular level, that those words were a debt. Damon spoke first, the voice of a man who knows he is outmatched and has decided to solve that problem with volume. "You stole a member of my pack." Cale looked at him. "I removed a wolf from a place that was killing her." Low, dense, the same voice from the yard. "There is a difference, though I wouldn't expect you to recognize it. She belongs to Asheville. She belongs to herself." Something in those gold eyes shifted, the same small, surface-level movement I had seen in the yard, the ripple that implied depth. "And she has chosen to be here, which means you are standing in my territory, threatening my pack, over a person whose agency you have never once respected." I watched Damon's face process that. I watched the moment he decided it didn't matter. "Give her back," he said, "or we take her." Cale was quiet for a long moment. Then something changed in him. Something I felt before I saw a shift in the density of his presence, in the quality of the air around him, as though the space he occupied had just been reclassified from ordinary ground to something considerably more significant. His wolf was pressing forward. Not emerging, not yet, but pressing, the massive, ancient, gold-eyed thing rising behind his human face like a tide coming in, like something that had been held in check by choice, and was now being given permission to reconsider. The Asheville wolves felt it. I watched it move through them, the involuntary step back, the lowered eyes, the specific, physiological response of lesser wolves in the presence of something their bodies recognize as apex before their minds have finished the calculation. Damon held his ground. I'll give him that. The particular doomed bravery of a man standing in front of a wave. Cale took one step into the water. "Take her," he said softly. "Try." And that was when I moved. I didn't decide to. Or maybe I did. Maybe the decision happened in the place where my decisions always happened, below the reach of rational thought, in the same deep-boned space where the knowing lived. I was at the water's edge before I had finished understanding why, standing between them in the shallow current with the cold water biting at my ankles and my hands open at my sides and my wolf, my careful, cautious, supposedly hollow wolf, standing absolutely upright inside my chest for the first time in my life. "Don't," I said. I was looking at Cale. His gold eyes found mine, and in them I saw the ancient, patient, terrifyingly controlled thing that lived behind his face. The wolf, the real wolf, the one that was older than any of these trees and had enough power in its body to end every wolf in this creek without adjusting its breathing. And it was looking at me with an expression I had never seen directed at me before. It was listening. "Don't kill him," I said, steady. My voice was steady. "I don't know how. He isn't worth becoming something you'll have to carry." The silence lasted 3 full heartbeats. Then something in Cale's face settled. The tide receded, not gone, never gone, but pulled back from the shore by something that looked, impossibly, like trust. Like a creature of immense and ancient power had just allowed a small, dark-furred omega to set its boundary. Not because she was stronger, because she was right. He looked at Damon. "Leave," he said. "Take your pack, don't come back to this territory." Damon opened his mouth. "If you speak," Cale said, in the same low, unhurried voice, "I will let her decide what happens to you instead of me, and I suspect she will be more merciful than I would be, but I wouldn't test it." Damon closed his mouth. He looked at me, standing in the creek between them, barefoot, bruised, 5'4" and 115 pounds of the wolf he had called hollow, and I saw something move across his face that I had waited my entire life to see there. Doubt. Not fear. Doubt. The first hairline fracture in the architecture of certainty he had built around his own limitations. I held his gaze. I didn't blink. And when he turned and walked back into the tree line with his 12 wolves trailing behind him like the retreating edge of something that had never been as large as it thought it was, I stood in the cold water and felt the knowing, for the first time in my life, settle into something that didn't ache. Behind me, Cale's voice, low, close, the warmth of him against the cold October air like a second fire. "She is mine," he said, not to Damon, not to the pack, to the forest, to the water, to whatever ancient, listening thing had decided, long before either of us was born, that this was how it would go. My mate. I didn't turn around. But my wolf, pressed against my ribs, standing tall, finally and completely still, already knew. He didn't come to me that night. Or the next one. I lay in the tent Sarah had arranged for me, real canvas, real warmth, a bedroll that smelled of cedar and clean wool, and I listened to the Ironville camp settle into its nighttime rhythms around me. The low conversation of the watch wolves, the fire banking down, the particular layered quiet of a pack at rest that is fundamentally different from the quiet of a pack that is afraid. This quiet had weight, good weight, the weight of something that knows what it is. I stared at the canvas ceiling and thought about the creek, about standing in the cold current between 2 alphas with my hands open and my wolf upright, and my voice coming out steady when nothing else about the situation was. About the way Cale's face had changed when I spoke, that settling, that receding tide, and the specific quality of attention he had turned on me afterward. Like I had shown him, something he had been waiting to see. I thought about what Sarah had said. He wants you to choose it. On the 3rd morning, I found him at the granite outcropping before dawn, which I suspected was not a coincidence, because I was beginning to understand that very few things Cale did were coincidences. He was sitting on the stone with his forearms on his knees and his gold eyes on the eastern horizon, where the sky was just beginning to consider the possibility of light. Not meditating, not performing stillness. Just genuinely, completely present in the way that people who have lived a very long time sometimes are, as though they have made their peace with the passage of moments and no longer feel the need to be anywhere other than inside the current one. I sat beside him. Not close enough to touch, close enough to be deliberate about it. He didn't look at me, but I felt the quality of his attention shift, that atmospheric change, the air reorganizing itself slightly, the specific density of being noticed by something that notices completely. We sat like that for a while, long enough for the horizon to begin its slow, serious work of becoming morning. Then I said, "Why haven't you completed the bond?" He was quiet for long enough that I thought he might not answer. Then he turned his head and looked at me with those gold eyes in the gray pre-dawn light, and what was in them was so straightforward, so undefended, that it took me a moment to process it. I was so accustomed to looking for the subtext in people's faces that the absence of it was disorienting. "Because you have spent your entire life," he said, "having things decided for you, what you are, what you're worth, where you belong." A pause, not for effect. He wasn't a man who paused for effect, for accuracy. "I will not be another thing that happens to you without your permission." The knowing settled into my chest, deep and clean, and without the ache it usually carried. "The bond already exists," I said. "You know that." "Yes." "You felt what they did to me, from 4 miles away." "Yes." "That's not nothing." "No," he said, "it isn't." I looked at his profile, the scar along his jaw silver in the early light, the patience in him that wasn't passivity. I understood that now, after 3 days in his PAX company, watching him move through the world with that unhurried certainty. It wasn't the patience of someone waiting for things to be given to him. It was the patience of someone who understood that the things worth having require the time they require, and not a moment less. He had been patient for me. A man of his power and his age and his capacity for absolute authority had folded all of that back on itself and sat on a granite outcropping in the pre-dawn cold and waited. Not for me to be ready, not for fate to force the issue, but for me to choose. I felt the door inside my chest, the one I had closed so quietly, so carefully, so finally in Dorna's office when I was 15 years old, open. Not creak, not inch, open. The way things open when the reason for keeping them closed no longer exists. I reached out and put my hand over his. He went very still. Not the controlled stillness of restraint, the particular stillness of something enormous and ancient being, unexpectedly and completely, undone by something small. "I choose it," I said. "I choose you, not because of the bond, not because fate decided, because you stood in a creek and let me stop you. Because you gave me a bowl of food and a place to belong and you didn't ask me to be grateful for it." I paused. "Because you waited." He turned his hand under mine, and his fingers closed around it with a careful, absolute certainty that felt like the first thing in a very long time that was exactly as large as it needed to be. No more, no less. He looked at me in the growing light, and the gold of his eyes was very warm and very old and very, completely present. "Are you sure?" he asked. Not doubt, confirmation. The last careful step of a man who had come this far and was not willing to assume. "I'm sure," I said. He leaned in slowly, slowly enough that I could have moved, could have reconsidered, could have closed the distance myself if I'd chosen to, giving me every option until the last possible moment. I closed the distance myself. The bond snapped into place like a sound I had been hearing at the edge of my awareness my entire life, suddenly, finally, at full volume. Warm and vast and certain, flooding through me from the point of contact outward, restructuring everything it touched. When we broke apart, I was breathing differently. The world looked the same. But the quality of the air, the weight of the morning, the feeling of my own skin, all of it had shifted a half-degree toward something I didn't have a word for. Home, maybe. Or fate. Or maybe both of those things were the same thing, and I had just never been in a position to know it. Cale's forehead came to rest against mine. His eyes closed. And in the quiet of that granite outcropping with the dawn finally, fully arriving through the pines, I felt him not just beside me, not just holding my hand, but present in the deep interior space that had been mine alone my entire life. Steady, patient, permanent. I bit him. Not hard, not breaking skin. That came later, in the full claiming, with the whole pack witnessing and the bond completing itself in the way these things complete, ancient and irreversible and chosen. But here, now, in the gray gold morning, I pressed my teeth against the curve of his shoulder and felt him exhale, slow and long, and with the quality of something that has been held for a very long time finally being allowed to set itself down. His arms came around me, careful, like something precious, like something he had been careful with long before he had permission to hold it. "Mine," I said quietly against his shoulder. And for the first time in the long, deliberate, ancient life of the alpha of the Ironville pack, he laughed. Low and warm and real. "Yours," he agreed. He meant it. Every molecule of that gold-eyed, scar-jawed, endlessly patient man meant every syllable of it, in the way that only things chosen freely and completely can be meant. And the forest, for the first time in as long as I could remember, exhaled. Winter came early to the Ironville territory that year. The first snow fell 3 weeks after the creek. I stood at the tree line and watched it come down through the pines, slow and particular, and without any urgency, the way snow falls when it has all the time in the world, and I felt the forest breathing around me the way it used to breathe before everything changed. That low, layered, ordinary alive sound, wind in the needles, the creek running beneath its new skin of ice, the small unseen things moving through the undergrowth with no particular concern. The mountain was not afraid anymore. Neither was I. Behind me, the camp was loud with the specific, warm chaos of a pack that has just been given a reason to celebrate, fires burning high. Sarah's laughter cutting above everything else the way it always did. The smell of something extraordinary happening in the communal kitchen that my wolf had strong opinions about. Cale's hand found mine in the dark. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. That was the thing I was still learning about him, still unwrapping in the quiet moments between everything else, that his silences were not absences. They were presences, full and warm and deliberate, carrying everything words would have made smaller by trying to contain. I leaned into him. He pulled me closer with the easy, absolute certainty of a man who has made a decision at the cellular level and has no remaining questions about it. "You're thinking loudly again," he said. "I do that." "I know," his voice, low, warm, the density of it in my chest like something permanent. "I like it." I looked up at him. Gold eyes in the firelight, the scar along his jaw. The patience that wasn't waiting anymore because it had arrived, finally, exactly where it had always been going. "I love you," I said. Not performed, not frightened, not offered carefully into the space between us with one hand already on the door. Just true. He looked at me for a long moment with those ancient, unhurried eyes. "I love you too, little wolf," he said. And the snow kept falling through the pines, and the fire burned high. And somewhere in the eastern forest, the creek ran on beneath the ice, certain and continuous and completely, finally at peace. If today's story found you somewhere you needed it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment telling me which moment stayed with you longest. Your support keeps these stories coming. New stories arrive every week. You're exactly where you're supposed to be. We'll be here when you're ready for the next one.